Hello, everyone.
How you doing,
Hello,
Professor?
Mike. Good to see you, Mike. Good morning. How's everyone this morning?
Hello.
Hello. Good to see you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. My screen was saying I was muted. Okay, good. Any questions about anything?
Professor, you excited for Sullivan's to open up this weekend?
Oh, is it this weekend?
Yeah, Saturday.
Oh, good. Very good. Yeah. Are you? You must be.
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
Good.
I'm working at BMC right now, so I'm gonna go tomorrow morning right after work.
Oh, very good. Very good. You know, usually, often there are long lines. I don't know if there will be as long lines this year as there usually are for the opening. So,
I think there still will be.
yeah.
But who knows?
Okay. Well, good. We'll enjoy it. So, any other questions, comments, things we should talk about? Let me see. Last time we were talking about what you need to build a ship, and I think we pretty much had concluded that. And then this week, your first assignment was due, the artifact inquiry. And a couple of you have sent or posted or sent us what you have done. This could be a good time to talk about that and have those who did it show us their work. And those who have not yet posted can tell us what you're up to. So let's see, why don't we start with Megan, who talked about a pike pole. Are you there, Megan?
Yes, I am. Sorry. So I posted like the video on the blog. Do you want me to just like talk about it?
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Unless you'd like to show us the video too. I mean, that might.
Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. I can do that. Let's see. I think it's a little bit embarrassing, but we'll see.
Why is it embarrassing?
No, just see yourself on the screen.
Oh, yeah, I know the feeling.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can figure this out. Let's share screen. Share sound. Okay, is it up?
That's it, yes.
Okay, awesome. And then I think I hit the share sound thing, so it should work. So the artifact that I looked into from the USS Constitution Museum was the 1797 pattern boarding pike. I was interested in the armament of the ship and found the pike particularly intriguing. We've all grown up during a time period in which the typical weapon is a gun. It's difficult to imagine a time when guns weren't the most efficient weapon or go-to weapon. And spearing each other is something I see in movies and television shows, but for these men it was a reality. When ships crashed together during this time period, whether it be accidental or intentional, there were certain crew members assigned to attempt to board the enemy ship. These men were deemed boarders, and they would grab pistols, cutlasses, and pikes, like the artifact that I looked at. They were quickly organized into divisions, boarded the enemy ships, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Hand-to-hand combat often determined the victor of battles, so the pike did play an important role. The ships were also simultaneously firing on each other with muskets, rifles, and cannons. Pikes were used as spears in hand-to-hand combat as well as defensively to stop enemies from boarding a ship. This particular pike was designed to be used in a thrusting motion and was the United States Navy's standard pike for the War of 1812. Another unique element of the Navy pike is that it is made with no crossguard or ferrules because it can potentially get caught in the ship's rigging or nets. And that was what I learned about the pike, which is something that I had never really heard of before this. So, did it stop the share?
Yes, it did. Very good. So, any questions for Megan? Now, why did you choose the pike?
I was curious. Like I was just like looking through all the different collections and stuff, and I thought that would do something interesting to look into. Just because, like I was saying in the beginning of the video, like we're so used to like the go-to being guns and the automatic weapons and stuff like that, and especially considering like what hand-to-hand combat was in the close quarters. I remember reading about like the introduction to the collection that they were so close to each other, so they were limited in what they could use. Guns weren't as efficient during the time.
Mhm.
And so I saw that and I was like, what is that? And so I clicked on it and then I read about it and I was like, wow, like they really did this, because it was something that like I feel like I see,
Yeah.
but like they really went to war and had like spears and like spearing each other on the
Yeah.
top of the ship. So
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting.
Interesting. No. One question I have is, could you tell us what it's made of and what it looks like? Is it?
What it looks like, it said it could range anywhere between 8 and 12 feet in length.
Mhm.
And then the Navy spears didn't have anything, because like if you look at like other types of pikes, often they'll have things like sticking out of them, which I assume makes them more lethal.
Mhm.
But they were thin and didn't have anything on them, because otherwise they could potentially get cut in like the net and the rigging and
Mhm.
stuff like that.
Mhm.
I did not find out what it was made of, but I can
I see.
about that.
Yeah, good. Are there other questions for Megan on this? I think you did a very good job explaining how it was used and how the men were divided into divisions. So it's not just everybody grabbing whatever was ready to hand, but they actually had, they trained for this and prepared for this. And boarding was really, the thing you wanted to do, because you're actually fighting at close range. And so capturing the enemy ship is something you need to do. Good. Any other questions? Or
I kind of love talking about these weapons, because the idea of boarding is such a huge profile in pop culture, right? Like every pirate movie you've ever seen, the first thing they're doing is slamming into each other and boarding. But in fact, because of the brutality you're describing, Megan, and the uncertainty of actually winning, like boarding was the last thing you really wanted to do. And it most often occurred only when the ships had already accidentally, collided, and you were sort of forced into a state of defense. And the beauty of the boarding pike was that as this super long weapon, it was kind of unwieldy for you to carry with you as you were boarding another vessel, but you just sat there and plopped it in position, and it created a fence of spear points to prevent the other guy from boarding your ship. If you Google videos on either maybe the museum's Facebook page, but certainly the ship's official Facebook page, they still do on the Constitution crew do training exercises with boarding pikes, and you can see exactly how they would sort of like position themselves to prevent the enemy from boarding Constitution.
I read something too that with them, as like they got like more comfortable with them, or as they like changed shape over like the course of history, sometimes they would like position themselves. I feel like I've seen this in like movies as well, but they'll put themselves and they'll like all lined up, and there'll be like rows and rows and rows of them, so that like people like move away. I feel like I've seen people like as war tech like closing in on them, and those like people like lining up with all of them.
Yeah, that's the benefit of spears in warfare in general, and going back to ancient periods, where having that sort of wall of longer pike kind of weapons provided that bulwark against, particularly against charging enemies that you didn't want to get into close combat, like cavalry and stuff, or in this case, like somebody coming over the side. Crews that were actually doing the boarding were frequently issued with patterned cutlasses that were sort of mass-produced swords. But again, it was nowhere near as common as Johnny Depp would have you believe.
There's a line in one of Stephen Decatur's letters after the siege of Tripoli that I find hand to hand is not child's play. It says kill or be killed, because that's what's happening when you're aboard the enemy ship, is they're trying to kill you, and it's not defeat your ship, but actually kill you. So that's does make us think about the nature of warfare. So good. Anyone else have questions or things you wanted to know about the boarding pike? Okay, let's see. Sarah, can you show us your video?
Yeah, sure. Hold on, let me just share my screen. Okay, hold on. I don't know how to make the sound because I don't think it's connected to the sound at the moment, so hold on. What originally drew me to this portrait was how young the boy in the painting was. What was his story, and how did he end up on the USS Constitution? His name was George Ipsara Syrian. He was born in 1818 in the Aegean island of Sara, Greece. In 1824, when he was only 6 years old, he was orphaned when his mother placed him on a boat out of Sara during the War of Greek Independence. In 1827, when he was 9 years old, he joined the crew of Old Ironsides with the rank of boy, and then eventually becoming an ordinary seaman, until 1828, when Constitution reached Boston on July 4th. Aboard the Constitution, George met Lieutenant Robert Randolph, who became a mentor and later a sponsor to George's education. In 1832, however, Randolph was accused of fraud for $4,000, but was later found not guilty. President Andrew Jackson took a special interest in the case and presumed Randolph of being guilty. Jackson had him dismissed from the Navy, which led to a later altercation with the president. In response to a letter pleading the president to reinstate Randolph, in 1833 he responded, "He that has robbed the dead, a brother officer, ought not to associate with the honest." Nonetheless, he was the sponsor to commission this portrait of George. Painted by New York's portraiture for the young and beautiful of the upper class, Charles C. Ingham, who later went on to found the New York National Academy of Design. Aboard the USS Constitution, Lieutenant Robert Randolph introduced George Syrian to gunner George Marshall, who would later become George's mentor and teacher. George Marshall was born in 1782 in the Aegean island of Rhodes, Greece. He came to America in 1806, after which he built his naval career up as a gunner. In 1822, he wrote the first practical military gunnery manual for the U.S. Navy. In 1824, he was assigned to the USS North Carolina, where he met Lieutenant Randolph, after which they were both assigned to the USS Constitution. George Marshall taught George Syrian the trade of gunnery and treated him as a son, and pretty soon, Syrian would become his son-in-law. In 1837, George Syrian was assigned as a gunner at Gosport, Virginia. 3 years later, George married Eleanor Marshall. Together, they had 7 children, 4 surviving to adulthood. The Syrian family went on to have a long tradition in U.S. naval service, with George's son, Constantine A. Syrian, and grandson, George Syrian, serving in the Navy after him. George went on to have an incredible career, serving 37 consecutive tours on 20 different ships, including the USS Constitution World Tour, gunnery instructor at the Naval Academy during the Civil War, and at the Asiatic Station in Japan and Hong Kong. George retired in 1880 at 63 years old, after a 53-year career with one of the longest active duty service careers in U.S. naval history. George passed away on December 21st, 1891 in Portsmouth, Virginia, where he is buried today with the rest of his family. He leaves behind a long legacy of greatness, being inducted into the Surface Navy Hall of Fame in 2007, and having the George Syrian Meritorious Service Award given annually on the USS Constitution to an outstanding Chief Petty Officer from the worldwide fleet. George's story is one that captures the true American spirit and the extraordinary story of a young orphan boy who rose through the ranks to have an exceptional career that started on the USS Constitution. Yeah, that's it.
Well, that's very, very impressive. So you were drawn to this because George Syrian looked so young in the portrait. Then you did a lot of research to find out more about him and his story. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually I was watching a Ken Burns documentary and I kind of just got a little bit carried away. I was like all right, I'm just gonna go like full in on this. So Carl actually provided me with a lot of information like from documents about the Andrew Jackson kind of conflict. And there's a lot of information out there. Some people are kind of really like interested in this topic. So there were a lot of blogs, and the Navy's website had a lot of information, as well as like the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress.
Yeah. Now, had you had experience in doing a documentary like this?
No, actually, no.
So is there a software you use to put it together?
Yeah, so it's actually a free app. I have a PC, but I think it's probably available on Macs as well. It was just called Wondershare, and yeah, you just like can put in the pictures themselves and like do transitions, and then voiceovers and sound effects and text as well.
Okay. Wow. Did anyone else use this? By the way, I'm just asking. You know, I was kind of afraid if I had seen this at the beginning of the semester, I would have given up, because I thought this was well beyond my capabilities. But now you make it sound easy. You know, Carl has documents, and then you use this software and everything falls into place. And it is one thing to have a lot of information. It's another to be able to put it together in a compelling way. And you have a lot of kind of side stories, but they don't detract too much. You know, you don't get, I'd like to know more about the Randolph story and his fight with Jackson. And did he actually steal $4,000 from a dead officer? Or what do you think? I mean, you're closer to the story than I am.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the timing of when he introduced him to George Marshall was a little bit fishy. So like he was trying to set it up. Maybe that like he could just pass him off because he knew this whole big thing was coming, but I really have no clue. He was, you know, he was proven not guilty in the court. So
do you know what happens to Randolph after this?
I know that he was not reinstated in the Navy, but it was really difficult to find information on him actually. So I don't really know what happened to him after the whole conflict, but it wasn't in the Navy.
Okay, good. Any other questions or comments for Sarah?
Can I just get the name of that software again, just in case?
Yeah, it's called Wondershare.
Okay, sweet.
And it's
Thank
free,
you.
yeah. I mean, like, there's a version that, like, if you publish it, has a watermark on it, and you have to pay, like, not to have it, but it's really not that expensive, so it's kind of worth it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Sarah, what was the most interesting thing you learned from this project?
I think the most interesting thing was his life after meeting George Marshall. I think that, you know, I would have liked to know more. And I found out a lot of information through actually his obituary, which was written by his children. So they kind of gave a little bit more information, like the names of his parents and stuff that we don't really have documentation of. So I wish there was more information on that, but that was probably like the most interesting, like his family life.
That's interesting that not only does Marshall treat him like a son, but then Syrian marries Marshall's daughter and then has their family. It's really an interesting connection.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Sarah, I would say, before we move on real quickly, just to let you know that you're not alone in wondering more about Randolph, and we at the museum, as I think I may have told you in one of the emails, don't know a whole lot about him at all either. And, you know, we've always had questions about the entire relationship and, you know, this idea of sponsorship and what it meant and why Randolph was willing to do this. the portrait of George ends up going down through the Syrian family, not to the Randolph family. And as I shared with you, I found out as a result, frankly, of your inquiry about Randolph, and I started fishing around a little bit too. And we did find that in 1878, he had a widow who applied for a pension on behalf of Robert, who had died 10 years earlier. And that was not an oddity. In 1878, Congress passed a pension act that was designed to provide pensions to former military members who had served in the War of 1812. And it was part of a larger sort of kind of cleanup of that system in the wake of the Civil War. There were, sailors and soldiers who had served for the United States, but then sided with the Confederacy, and as a result had lost any previous benefits. And so the whole thing was kind of a mess. So they went back and tried to reinstate it all. So we know he eventually got married. We know he lived until the 1860s, but we don't really know much else about Randolph and what happened to him or his career after the Board of Inquiry that that he was charged with. So it's something that's on our to-do list for the future as well, and hopefully we'll be able to find out more. But as you discovered too, George Marshall, a much more significant figure and really a key point of modern gunnery and naval gunnery was Syrian's real sort of mentor and guide to his really, really incredibly long career. His descendants and family, Syrian's descendants and family, are still very active in trying to learn more about him as well too. And their descendants have come and spoken to us and looked at the original muster records where George and a couple other Greek boys his same age were rescued together at that point. So he's one of the more impressive stories of the ship's history for sure.
Yeah, it was the Syrian family, actually, I found out is very involved in the continuation of research today.
Yeah.
But that's very interesting. If you get more information, I'd love to hear it.
Touche. If you get more, let us know. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. My only point that I would point out to you is that I noticed it twice. The name of the Greek sea is the Aegean Sea, pronounced Aegean.
Yeah, I did note that after.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. And yeah, very good. Let's see. So who else, whether you have finished or not, would like to tell us what you're working on?
So I haven't finished yet, but
okay.
I have been looking through the Patriot, that news article from September, let me get the exact date here, September 18th, 1812, and just going through, finding really big snippets. And one thing that really stuck out to me, it's not really Constitution based, and so that's why I really wanted to make sure I could cover it before I started filming. It's about this kind of conflict up near Detroit with Native Americans and settlers. And so I really, they talk about how there was a surrender, and now a bunch of people from the Northwest are rushing to this, every village, town, or district. And it seemed really interesting. And the more I read about it, the more I think it would be really nice to cover this, but I really want to make sure I can.
Yeah, I would. No, that's a great story. And there is actually a Constitution tie-in, because the general in charge of Detroit was William Hull, who was the cousin of Isaac Hull. And the loss of Detroit is a major blow to the whole American psyche that this is going to be an easy war. And then then Isaac Hull's victory comes really in the wake of that. So you have that juxtaposition. Also, some years ago at one of the Constitution Museum dinners, I was seated with a man whose first name was Hull, and he is a descendant of General Hull. And he got very upset when people were asking him about fall of Detroit. And he said, no, there was no choice but to surrender. I mean, you can see this carrying this family burden. And General Hull, I believe, winds up living the rest of his life in Newton. So he's in this area. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, thought he should be shot for cowardice. Of course, Jefferson thought the war would be an easy thing, so Hull's surrender of Detroit kind of squelched that whole idea. So yeah, I think, there's not a direct, I think there's a close enough connection that you should do that if that's the story that interests you, unless Carl objects.
All right, for sure.
But yeah.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So I'll even just focus even directly on maybe the General Hall there, and maybe go into a little bit deeper. But
Okay.
definitely, I think that's
Yeah.
a good place to go. Thank you.
It is, yeah. It's a great story, yes. So let's see. Mike, have you found anything of interest?
Yeah, I was looking at an article that was on the copper cladding warships,
Oh, good.
which was kind of like the copper sheeting
Yeah.
that they were putting on the ships back in the 1760s.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to track down. It looks like in 2015 they took off and redid the actual hull of
Yes.
the U.S. Constitution. So I
Yes.
wanted to see if there was any artifacts, if they kept the original copper sheeting, to see if maybe there'd be a way to figure out I don't know, why it lasted so long. I think when they took it off, you could see it was all corroded, but it was still sturdy, still together. So I don't know why copper was chosen rather than something else.
Well, I'll defer to Carl, who knows much more about this than I do.
Yeah, so the ship was resheathed in copper in the 2015 to 2017 restoration. That, however, was not by no means original to the construction of the ship. That copper was redone, I want to say, in the 1990s or
1990s, yeah.
Yeah, it was then a part of the 1990 restoration. So that stuff would last about 20 years. The idea behind copper was that it stuff won't grow on it. And so, what kills a ship, and the reason that you want to put this on in the bottom in the first place, is twofold. One, you get marine growth, just general seaweed, barnacles, all that kind of stuff that attaches itself to the hull. And that has two impacts. One, it slows you down, right? You're creating a lot of drag. And if you see even a small sailboat that's been sitting at an anchorage abandoned for a long time, when they take it out of the water, it'll be hanging with kelp and kind of growth. So that's bad. But the other aspect of is that the growth and a couple other things deteriorate, particularly the wooden hull. And the largest and most impactful of those deteriorations is a marine woodworm that will burrow its way into wood from the water and will literally chew its way through the hull of a ship. And so the alternative to a copper sheathing clad is sort of a copper-based or metal-based or even lead-based paint that will deter growth from happening directly from the wood. But that's not, that's sort of another development a little bit later on as well, and is also kind of an expensive proposition. So this was a great solution, but it still does certainly over time deteriorate away. The copper is then with a thick layer of tar slapped over that wood and nailed in place. And it does a pretty good job of deterring growth, so much so that copper is often an element in modern bottom paints. The woodworm thing is not to be underestimated. I've read accounts in one short story from a little bit earlier time period in the colonial era, a merchant trader in the Caribbean, where warmer weather, this marine life is even more aggressive. And they were setting sail from St. Croix to St. Thomas on pretty nice weather, which is really kind of an afternoon day sail. and they were pumping like crazy the whole time and barely made it to St. Thomas. And halfway through, the chief mate went down because he could hear the water pouring into the boat, and he saw this like hole in the hull, and he went to go plug it up with a piece of salt beef that they were eating, using for food. And instead of plugging the hole, he managed to put his whole fist through the hull, and letting water come gushing in. And so they had to take a sail and father the hull, which meant you literally push the sail overboard, then pull it from the other side to create a sheath around it. And that barely got them to St. Thomas, where they abandoned the boat. Because they abandoned it, it ended up being an insurance claim that there were depositions and testimony about. But this was a real constant concern for the time period. As for your question of what happened to it, that copper, some of it, there's a lot of it. Some of it ended up being discarded, and a lot of it was recycled, and to other things. And in the basement of the museum, there's a 6-foot tall pile still of the sheets of it that we occasionally use for ceremonial awards and souvenirs and stuff. The stripped off stuff that came off in the 90s was also cooked down, and we've actually, you can actually purchase medallions, cheap plug here, from the museum gift shop, made out of copper that's been restored for, reclaimed from Constitution.
Available for purchase at the Constitution Museum store, yes.
Except through the gift shop.
Really good, that's right, yeah. Good. In 1803, when Preble came to take command of Constitution, which had basically been moored in the Charles River, because and then he has to go get it fit to go to the Mediterranean. He strips, 8, 10, lots and lots of seaweed off of the hull. And as a way of proving to the Secretary of the Navy how much there was, he sent 2 wagon loads of this seaweed down to Washington to show him. And the Secretary of the Navy was a little puzzled. What's he supposed to do with all of this? But it's extraordinary how fast it grows. And, the ships would, so it is a problem. The ship's not going to sail very fast. Even
today, you see a boat sitting, in the harbor in Boston, like the recreational boats that are there in the summertime. And you leave it for a week, you come back, and you'll start to see a sheath of, a green growth spreading out from it.
Yeah. And it's a chemical process. I know I'm going to get the figures wrong. I remember the captain saying when they were doing the restoration a few years ago that in the 1990s, they had put 13 tons of copper on the hull, and then they took off 8 tons of copper. He said that showed the copper was actually doing its job because it corrodes as it's repelling. I think that's the chemical process that it's doing.
Yeah, there's a little bit of an ablative nature to it, but mostly it's just that the life won't, it's inhospitable to the marine life that wants to attach to it and grow on it. The other sort of issue that does cause corrosion is electrolysis, and when you get mixed metals connecting and an electrical charge through the water, which is quite common along the waterfront wharfs where there's been electrical lines run out to buildings and stuff, that are in the water for like 100+ years. You essentially can turn all the water around a dock or a wharf into a big battery, and it starts to eat away at metal and copper.
Oh, good. So you have much to work on, Mike. Let's see, Ray, what are you working on?
I am working on a sextant.
Oh, good. What have you found out about it?
Well, it was a critical piece of navigation equipment, especially in the days, before GPS radar and the like.
Mhm.
And you would use it to determine latitude and longitude.
Okay, good, good, good. Okay.
So it was
Anything else?
for keeping
Mhm.
the Constitution going in the right direction and allowing the sailor to figure out where the heck they were.
True, very true. Okay, good, good. You have any questions you want answered before you finish, or anything else you wanted to tell us?
No.
Okay. I'll look forward to seeing it. Let us see. Mike DeAngelis, what are you working on?
Yeah, I actually posted a video, but it was a
Okay,
little
great.
bit longer. So if you
good.
want, I can give a little bit of a Spark Notes version of it, just kind of talking about the
How
artifact.
how long is it?
Well, I wouldn't say it's great, but it's about 8.5 minutes. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah. If you want, I can just kind of give a brief overview of like what I talked about in the video.
Okay. Okay.
So basically the artifact that I chose was the notes that Amos Evans took during Dr. Benjamin Rush's lectures. I didn't see too much information outside of what was provided on the USS Constitution Museum website as far as what was like in the notes, because I noticed on the USS Constitution Museum website, it looks like it really only had like the cover page that said that it was like what volume it was. So what I actually did was I kind of dug deep into who Amos Evans was. And he was actually a pretty important figure, especially during the War of 1812, when he was stationed on the Constitution between 1812 and 1813. And I kind of did a little bit of background research into like how he came to the medical field as well. And one thing, the reason why I actually chose this artifact was because I'm actually in another history class where we just previously talked about Dr. Benjamin Rush and his importance with the Lewis and Clark expedition and how he prescribed like dozens of his famous bilious pills. And I just thought it was so interesting to kind of tie the two in with one another. So I did talk a little bit about Benjamin Rush and his bilious pills and how, I mean, essentially Dr. Benjamin Rush believed a lot of like disease and illnesses were related to like constipation, mainly constipation. So his bilious pills were essentially a laxative. But yeah, for the artifact itself, like I said, I kind of talked more about Amos Evans and his life and how these notes kind of led to Evans on the Constitution and his role on the Constitution, like where he worked. And yeah, I mean, just him being an important figure during 1812 to 1813. And I also focused a little bit on his life after the Constitution as well, when he was on USS Independence. And one thing I actually found incredibly interesting was his protocol that he instituted while he was on the Independence. He apparently like witnessed firsthand how smallpox at the time was kind of going between, ship to ship, very easily spreading. And he instituted this protocol, which I found extremely interesting, which made it so in order for new crew members to board the ship, they needed to be, I don't know if I guess vaccinated in a sense. This was right after the time where they came up with the vaccination.
Well, inoculated.
Inoculated.
It's the live virus they're using.
Inoculation. Yep. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Wow.
I talked a little bit about his time on the Independence.
Oh wow, interesting.
Not too much. And then I talked a little bit about his life after he left the Independence, where he returned to Maryland and started his own private practice. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that sounds interesting. A very interesting story, and good. I look forward to what. Yes, Carl.
Yeah, Mike, I was just taking a look. If you're interested in it, I don't believe it's publicly available on our website. It may be in the Digital Public Library of America link through the Digital Commonwealth. But some, not all, and I was just, as you were speaking, taking a look at our, at the museum's catalog collection and collections catalog. And we do have scanned images of some of Amos Evans' notes on I believe it is on the Bush lectures. So if you're interested, drop me an email or something, and I can either give you a link, or I'll download some of those scans and I can forward them off to you.
Yeah, sounds great. I will definitely send over an email. I mean, for the most part, his notes are pretty much just Dr. Benjamin Rush's notes. You know what I mean? Because they said that he took a lot of it at just like face value, just wrote it down. Yeah, pretty much.
Well, Rush was the most eminent medical guy of the day. So even though it turns out he was wrong about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, though, his use of mercury in his bilious pills proved to be useful in research like nowadays, their ability to trace Lewis and Clark's expedition trail.
Wow.
So because mercury was passed, so quickly, especially with it being a laxative, scientists are actually able to go out and track that trail of mercury, so they can figure out exactly where Lewis and Clark was.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay. Let's see, Trevor.
We'll try this at home, kids.
Yeah.
So I did my research on the night or day telescope. So I thought it was pretty interesting, just because I preferred to do my research on like a physical object rather than one of the documents or paintings. And my research led me in maybe two or three different directions. So first, I did some research on the company that made it, the Thomas Harris and Son Company. It's believed to have belonged to Isaac Hull. So I looked into his background a bit. And I also had no clue how telescopes work. I'm not really a science guy, so I looked into that for my own benefit. So this particular telescope, Hull had 2 cents on the Constitution, and if this did belong to him, I tried to find out how soon after it was made it was on the Constitution, and if it were from his first stint, if he had it the first time he was on the Constitution, which to me seems a little more likely because he had more day-to-day responsibilities in his first stint, so it seems like he would be kind of the one to look out and try to chart. Then it was probably made just about 3 years before he was on the Constitution, or while he was on the Constitution, because the stamp on it has Thomas Harrison's son, but the son didn't enter the business until about 1800. So the company was founded in 1780, but the son joined on, so the stamp would have changed around that time. He also had his stint on the Constitution in the 1830s, I believe, so it could have been something he had throughout his whole career. My research into telescopes. So what got me onto it was that what makes this a night or day telescope is that it lets more light in so that you're able to see at night. So I was wondering how that didn't just blind people during the day. From what I gathered, you adjust the magnifying piece close to the eyepiece to let more or less light in, and that will either shrink or enlarge the end of the telescope. And the principle that I thought of when I read that was your eye contracting to let more or less light in. So I guess you can probably see further when your pupils aren't dilated. So when your pupil is larger, it lets more light in. You can see further away. But if there's more light coming at you, then the pupil will retract, and you'll still be able to see the same thing, but from a much smaller shape. So that's how I looked at how the telescope was operating.
Wow. That's good.
That was pretty much the extent of my research, though.
Well, that's good. And, I think probably that, came from their observation of how your eye works too, the lens or the contracts or expands. Good. Anything you couldn't find out that you wished you could after this?
Not a ton. I was interested because these telescopes now are pretty coveted anyway, because it was one of the bigger companies of the day. So there's a lot of fascination with the antiques themselves, but just the fact that it belonged to Isaac Hall too, or could have belonged to Isaac Hall, makes it even more interesting.
Yeah. Good.
I think from a museum historian standpoint, I think there's a couple of cool aspects to that whole story that you just told. One is that, tracking down sort of the provenance of the object and its connection to the company, and is the work that we do, all the time, right? When somebody calls us with one of these things in their basement or their attic that, great grandpa had, and you have to sort of track it down, looking at the marks, figuring out when the company was in business and what mark was on it, helping narrow down the legitimacy of the story that this really did come from that company. If you want to see more examples of that, all you need to do is tune in the Antiques Roadshow on PBS, right? Tell me it's worth $1 million. No, I'm sorry, it has the wrong mark. But the other aspect of this that I think is really fascinating, and this goes for the Amos Evans stories too, is that what you're seeing in both of these stories is the really tight connections between the development of this maritime expansion, the creation of navies, but more significantly, the growth of offshore commerce, offshore seagoing activities, and the development of science that was making those voyages possible, whether it was through health initiatives to keep sailors healthy, or through the development of optical lenses that was allowing telescopes, sextants like the one Ray's working on, and other scientific instruments to identify where the ship was, see other vessels, that in the entire history of optics is really tightly connected to sort of the whole growth of maritime exploration, discovery, and transit. And so it is it's a linkage to these whole other kind of arenas of history that I've always found kind of cool.
It is, yes. That's good, very good. Let's see, Mo, do you have something to share with us? He's here, but is he on? Okay. So this has been interesting hearing what people are doing, and I'm sorry that, Mike, we didn't get a chance to look at, your video on this, on Amos Evans. What really strikes me is the different questions that come up as you're looking at a particular object, or the different things you can then find out. I mean, the different stories you can tell. It's really interesting, the questions that Trevor had about the telescope, the company that made it, who owned it, different areas you can look at, or, the story of George Syrian goes in a lot of different directions, and Megan with the pike pole. I mean, you can see, the whole evolution of warfare. So this has been interesting, and I look forward to seeing the work that you have, those of you who've not yet finished, and I know the rest of us do too. Good. So let us see what else we have on our agenda today. A couple of weeks ago, I sent you a bunch of documents on the Barbary Wars, which I know some of you then jumped on and looked at. I thought what we could do now is talk about Constitution's role in the war with Tripoli, which is, doesn't have as big a role in the war with France, and then the Jefferson administration is committed to cutting government spending, paying off the federal debt. That was really Jefferson's obsession, a good obsession, I should say. When we use the word obsession, sometimes it means has a negative connotation, but paying off the national debt. But at the same time, when he became president in March of 1801, there was this problem with Tripoli. That is, Tripoli was threatening to declare war on the United States, which it did in May of 1801, declaring war by sending some guys to the American consulate and cutting down the flagpole in front of it. In fact, they notified the consul that we're going to be sending guys to cut down the flagpole tomorrow, so you might want to get your wife and children where they won't be upset by this. And so the next morning, a party arrives to try to cut down the flagpole, and it takes them a while. They didn't have the right axes to do this, so they thought it would be an easy thing to go cut down the flagpole, but they have to come back in the afternoon to finish cutting down the flagpole, which announces that Tripoli now is at war with the United States. And one reason Tripoli, well, there are a couple of reasons Tripoli declared war on the United States. One is that the treaty the United States had made with Tripoli back in 1796 had indicated that Tripoli was subservient to Algiers, and Tripoli didn't like that. Secondly, Tripoli benefited by capturing merchant ships, and so capturing American merchant ships would be a useful thing. Tripoli also had been on the verge of war with Sweden and didn't want to fight Sweden and the United States at the same time. And so Tripoli anticipated, also the treaty that the United States had made back in 1796 also indicated that every year the Americans would pay Tripoli a certain amount to send them naval stores, naval supplies, the things we were talking about last week. And the United States was slow to do that. And so the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, wanted to declare war on the United States as a way of getting the United States to send more stuff, as well as to allow Tripoli to capture American merchant ships if the United States wasn't sending more stuff. And he is doing this at the same time as Thomas Jefferson is becoming president. And of course, Jefferson had for the previous 15 years been saying, he was almost alone among American statesmen being really irate about having to pay tribute to Algiers, Tripoli, and these other places. As a minister to France, he had wanted to raise a naval force to fight Algiers. And he had said that we'll never have a better cause or a weaker enemy. And in his first report on the Mediterranean trade, had also advocated using military force to protect American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And now at the same time that the Pasha of Tripoli is declaring war, Jefferson is becoming president, and he writes to, in his message to Congress at the end of the year, he says that the demands of the Pasha of Tripoli could admit of but one answer. That is, he wants to declare war on us. Well, we're not going to make a treaty with him. We're going to go to war. The problem for Jefferson was he had cut government spending, and it all but eliminated the Navy. That is, Jefferson thought, we have these big expensive ships, why don't we take them apart? And if we ever need them, we can put them back together again rather than maintaining them. And so he wants to fight a war in the Mediterranean using the smallest force possible. So if you send a ship to blockade Tripoli, that would pretty much be enough, which doesn't turn out to be an effective way of fighting Tripoli. So, and the war lasts for about 5 years, and for much of it, I see Sean yawning with this recounting of the story of the Tripolitan War, because the first couple of years are kind of boring. One of the commanders, Richard Valentine Morris, takes his wife along on a Mediterranean cruise, wife and daughter actually, and never actually go to Tripoli. Because if you're taking your wife and daughter on a Mediterranean cruise, why would you want to go to a place where there might be a war? So they go to Greece and they go to Italy and other places. And It's a nice cruise, but at the end of it, Morris is court-martialed actually for not doing anything. So that should be a cautionary tale for any of you who are thinking about something similar. So you have this war kind of being fought with one hand tied behind the United States' back for reasons of economy, as well as, for reasons of, well, it's not really a military strategy. What we want to do is blockade Tripoli. We really don't need a huge military force. And this is, let me see, I do actually have some slides I can show you that might be useful to look at. Okay. Let me see. Okay. One of the vessels the United States sent to Tripoli was the Enterprise, commanded by Andrew Sterot, who is an American commander. And this is Captain Sterot in the schooner Enterprise, paying tribute to Tripoli in August of 1804. This is one of the first encounters in the Tripolitan War. This is a woodcut from the time. That is a piece of wood. It's like a copper engraving, but in wood. So it's a little bit coarser than copper or other kinds of an engraving. This is Captain Sterot paying tribute to Tripoli. And that's really a play on the notion of paying tribute. It's when Sterot was asked if the United States was coming to pay tribute to Tripoli, he said, yes, their tribute will be with cannonballs, and which is actually something the United States was supposed to be delivering to Tripoli, but he delivers them through his cannon and defeats this Tripolitan ship in the Mediterranean. And in his annual message, President Jefferson calls this the first episode of American valor. That's what he called it in the draft. His Secretary of the Treasury pointed out there had been other episodes of American valor, so he shouldn't really take credit entirely for this one. It's a natural thing for a president to claim what he is doing is something no one else ever thought of until he became president. This is the beginning of the war, which I said then doesn't go as, we don't have many other acts of valor like this. And also in this particular battle, a number of Tripolitan sailors die, but none of the Americans do. And in his annual message, Jefferson shows that we are committed to the expansion of the human race rather than its destruction. So, but then the strategy is to blockade Tripoli rather than to actually go and fight in Tripoli. And we're blockading essentially using one or two ships because we don't want to expand the naval force because that's a very expensive thing. Here you can see a poem about Sterot's sea fight. It was probably set to music. Carl may know the tune that this was meant to be sung to. Stand to your guns, my hearts of oak, let no word on board be spoke. Victory soon will crown the joke, be silent and be ready. And it goes on from there. Let me see if we can get this thing out of the way. Think the Moorish Tripolines all were amazed who beheld the scenes. Not great poetry, but patriotic poetry coming out of this initial fight between Tripoli and the United States in August of 1801. And then our friend William Bainbridge is sent in the USS Philadelphia. Yes, Trevor.
Is this why Tripoli is in, I think it's the Marines fight song?
It is why the Tripoli is in. We'll get to that because this is a war that the United States fights between 1801 and 1805. And in April of 1805, we'll get to that, a party, well, we'll get to that, but yes, it is. This is, lots happens in this war. I'm glad you asked because often I'm afraid people know all about this. So Morris is succeeded by our friend William Bainbridge in the USS Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia was a ship built in Philadelphia, and actually it was raised by subscription. We talked last time about the Navy paying to build these frigates, but the Navy also allowed citizens to subscribe to build a ship and give it to the Navy. And in this case, the merchants of Philadelphia got together and paid for the construction of a ship, which they named the Philadelphia, a frigate like the Constitution. And this is then under the command of Bainbridge and sent to blockade Tripoli. And in August of 1803, in October of 1803, Philadelphia is cruising off of Tripoli, and a number of smaller Tripolitan vessels come to engage it, and they wind up chasing each other around, and the Philadelphia runs aground on some rocks that were not charted outside the harbor of Tripoli. And it's now surrounded by these smaller vessels, and because of the way the ship is kind of tilted, they can't use their guns against these smaller vessels. And Bainbridge winds up surrendering. One of the Marines aboard, I posted on the Blackboard site, this book by William Ray, who is an American Marine. He had become a Marine kind of by accident. He wanted to be actually a poet, and he had worked for a newspaper in upstate New York, and then he has a promise that he has a job editing a magazine in Philadelphia. So he heads down to Philadelphia in 1802, but the job had fallen through. So he's kind of stranded there without any money, and he decides to enlist in the Marines. And he enlists in the Marines. He's sent aboard the Philadelphia, and he's absolutely thrilled to be assigned to the Philadelphia because he thinks he'll be able to both see the world as well as experience the valor of being in the military. But it turns out he really hates being in the military. And he finds that it's a brutal place. He really doesn't like the way the men are treated. They're flogged for all kinds of minor infractions. And he though does have the outlet of writing poetry and writing about what he's experiencing. And he does have some poems published in the newspapers, first about how great it is to be going to sea. And he has one, let me see if I can find this poem I wanted to share with you. Here it is. Nope, that's not it. Let's see. Nope, this is the same thing. Okay. Well, one of his poems says, "Should in our cruise some hostile flag be seen, the Moor, the Turk, or Algerine," and then he has a number of lines talking about Achilles and Hercules and other heroes of old. And he says, "The valiant look of Bainbridge shall inspire." That is, he sees William Bainbridge as equal to these valorous heroes of old. And then he did add a couple of lines later saying, well, it really didn't turn out that way because Bainbridge surrenders the ship to the Tripolitans. Bainbridge becomes the second American captain to surrender his vessel to an enemy. And he didn't fire a shot in this encounter. By the way, does anyone other than Carl know who the first American captain to surrender his vessel to an enemy was? It happened in 1798 during the war with France. Well, it was William Bainbridge, and he hadn't fired a shot in that encounter either. So Bainbridge and his men are taken to Tripoli as prisoners. And by the way, Bainbridge had tried to lighten the ship to get it off of this rock, throwing out guns and water and so on, but that really didn't work because the tide was going out. The next day, when the tide comes in, the ship floats and the Tripolitans are able to tow it back into Tripoli. And meanwhile, these guys have been pretty much stripped of any valuables they have. And the men are being kept in a former bakery, well, in a prison actually. Bainbridge and the officers are being kept in the palace. But he realizes this is a bad thing. And one of the documents I sent you to read was his letter to his wife, which is really quite a striking thing. Just think about it. You know, he pretty much knows this is the end of his career, since he surrendered once, then he surrendered again, and the Navy's, he hopes ultimately to be vindicated. Let me see if I can find this letter of Bainbridge to his wife, Susan, back in New Jersey. And well, it must have been in another pile. Now, Carl, he's also writing to Preble, who is the commander of the, Preble is here on the Constitution. Preble had arrived in the Mediterranean in the late summer, early fall, and Preble's first task was to go to Morocco because the United States was having some trouble with the Emperor of Morocco. And Preble is able to make peace with Morocco. Morocco, by the way, had recognized American independence back in 1784. Well, earlier than that. And the United States had a treaty with Morocco, but then there was a disagreement and Preble is able to solve it. And then he and Bainbridge are supposed to be cooperating on this blockade of Tripoli and escort American merchant ships. And then Preble finds out that Bainbridge has actually lost the Philadelphia, essentially lost half of the American fighting force in the Mediterranean. And he finds this out indirectly. Bainbridge is writing to him and writing to other people, but it's not as though he can go put the letter in a mailbox. He has to send it with someone. In this case, it's the Danish consul in Tripoli who will send letters out, can send messages out, and then it's hard for messages to get back in. And also, Bainbridge knows anything he writes is going to be read by the Tripolitans. So he has to be a little bit circumspect in what he is writing, and also writes with letters, alternating lines of ink and then lemon juice, so that you can hold the letter up to a light and you'll see the secret writing. Carl, does the museum have any of the those documents on?
Yeah, we do indeed. This is the, if you ever did this when you were kids, and you know, you may have or may not. So you can do this. You can still do it at home, and we actually still do this with student classes. So this is a method of passing secret messages, and you write it on the paper in lemon juice. And so initially, because it has no real color, it doesn't really show up. But if you heat the paper later on, it changes the nature of the lemon juice that's soaked up in the fibers of the paper, and the writing can become visible. And so Bainbridge is doing this from his imprisonment there. And we do have copies of some of those letters. This is a technique that's used again later on in a deception down in the South Atlantic. When he is leaving messages later on when he's comparing a Constitution, and is leaving messages for David Porter on the Essex, who he was supposed to meet up with down there. But they're trying not to tip their hand to the fact that the Americans are now in the South Atlantic. But yeah, we do have it on this, and you know, with age and stuff, it's not as clearly visible, but you still can make out like the differences on one side where this writing and invisible writing is, and the other side of the paper where the you know, where the regular writing is. It's kind of cool. Definitely espionage in the espionage and surreptition in the 1800s.
Yeah. Why don't we take a break at this point, and when we come back, we can talk more about Tripoli and what's going on in the Mediterranean.
I'm impressed, Bob. You got the whole pot right there. You're on mute.
They don't have to move from this spot.
I know. I wish I thought of the same. Need to buy a carafe.
Yeah, I got this. I think I got this for Christmas. So.
Nice.
So, okay. So I was able to find the letters. So let's see. Let's take a look at this one. Okay. So this is William Bainbridge's letter to his wife, Susan. And would someone like to read it aloud? Or do I need to?
I'll read it.
Great, thanks, Sean.
You want like an accent, or you want me to just like read it?
What do you mean, like an accent?
I can get a little dramatic, add some tension.
Yeah, that would be good.
My dear Susan, with feelings of distress which I cannot describe, I have to inform you that I have. You make it a little bigger. That I have lost the beautiful frigate, which. Also, can you move it a little? Sorry. Which was placed under my command by running her afoul of rocks a few miles to the east of this harbor, which are not marked in the charts. After defending her as long as a ray of hope remained, I was obliged to surrender, and am now, with my officers and crew, confined in a prison in this place. I enclose to you a copy of my official letter to the Secretary of the Navy, from which you will learn all the circumstances in detail connected with our capture. My anxiety and affliction does not arise from my confinement and deprivations in prison. These indeed I could bear if 10 times more severe, but is caused by my absence, which may be protracted, one, from my dearly beloved Susan, and an apprehension which constantly haunts me, that I may be censured by my countrymen. These impressions, which are seldom absent from my mind, act as a corroding canker at my heart. So maddened am I sometimes by the workings of my imagination that I cannot refrain from exclaiming that it would have been merciful dispensation of Providence if my head had been shot off by the enemy while our vessel lay rolling on the rocks.
I don't know why you find that funny. He's writing to his wife saying, I'd rather my head were shot off by the enemy than.
Yeah, it's raw emotion.
It's raw emotion. Yeah, okay. Well, go on. Just one more paragraph, I think.
You now see, my beloved wife, the cause of my distress. My situation in prison is entirely supportable. I have found here kind and generous friends, such as I hope the virtuous will meet in all situations. But if my professional character be blotched, if an attempt be made to taint my honor, if I am censured, if it does not kill me, it would at least deprive me of the power of looking any of my race in the face, always excepting, however, my young, kind, and sympathizing wife. If the world desert me, I am sure to find welcome in her arms, in her affection, to receive the support and condolence which none others can give.
I think when we make the movie, Carl, we're going to have Sean as Bainbridge, because it's really conveying this. Let's see. And he goes on about, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, good. your effect.
I think I like Sean for the Tripolitans, mocking Bainbridge as he goes to prison.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Poor Bainbridge. I mean, just until you read that, I hadn't really picked up on that. I'd rather my head were shot off by maybe kind of almost wishing that. Now, how do you suppose? So apparently he's not only sending this to her, he's also sending a copy of his letter to the Secretary of the Navy, which is a little longer. And so he's having to have a lot of these letters copied too. It's not like he has you can't just hit CC. You actually physically have to make copies of these things. Any thoughts on how she's going to react to this news that the beautiful frigate that he
she'd probably be a little upset, like that he's captured. This would be the second time, right?
Yeah. I think they might have been married since, because actually in 1798 he was the youngest man up to that point ever to become a captain in the Navy. So he's now early 30s, I'm thinking, and there aren't that many captains too. So he is one of a small group, and here he has lost this frigate, and she's back home in New Jersey and gets this letter from him. And meanwhile, anyone else have thoughts on Bainbridge and his misfortune? He seems, he's met kind friends here, like the Danish consul, and he's being kept in one of the palaces of the Pasha of Tripoli. And the men are being kept in a much worse place. And in fact, they're being put to work and do other things by the Tripolitans. And so it's not entirely insupportable for him or the officers and midshipmen. In fact, he has the midshipmen continue their instruction by their in seamanship and in navigation. David Porter, who is one of the lieutenants aboard, conducts a school for the midshipmen on navigation, and all using blocks of wood on the floor. The men, though, are being put out to work, and a number of them start dying. We'll get to this in a bit. Yeah. So here is Bainbridge. Megan, were you raising your hand, Megan?
Yes. I remember when I read the letters, I never even thought about the fact, it makes sense that the people that were captured him would read his letters before they sent them out. But I was just thinking, I was like, wow, he must be I'm surprised that, I guess he was an officer who's captain, so he would be in a good place. But when he's saying I'm totally fine here, the imprisonment's wonderful, I've met all these friends, I never even thought about the fact that he's definitely saying that because they're reading it. But then that also makes me think about if he really was staying up in a palace and he really did have it great. And then in Preble,
it's great. The palace is big, and so he's in a cell in the palace. It's not like the Pasha's given him a stateroom. You're right, but also he's writing to reassure her that things aren't completely insupportable. Because he doesn't want her to worry too much. So so I see what you're saying, that he also knows they're seeing this, but also she's seeing this, and how is she going to react?
I remember he also, if he's staying in a better situation than the rest of his men, he was criticizing them in future letters for not refusing to work.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Which I thought I thought that was a little bit odd too, considering he's in a better living situation than them, in imprisonment. If they were help them build a ship or be punished or go without food or go without water. I thought it was interesting that he's expecting them to just take punishment.
It is. It is. Having read through all of this, I have to say I didn't leave with a high impression of Bainbridge as commander of these men, because and in fact William Ray, the guy whose poetry we started reading, really blasts Bainbridge in his book. And he publishes the book after they're back and sends a copy to Bainbridge, hoping Bainbridge will give him an endorsement. But and Bainbridge, of course, won't, because he's really blasted Bainbridge in the book. And the ship's doctor, too, had published his journal, Dr. Cowdery. And Cowdery is going off to treat the Pasha and the Pasha's family. And then he notes in his journal one day that one of the sailors died today, the same day that the doctor is off treating the crown prince. And William Ray makes a lot of this in his book, saying here, if the doctor had actually been attending to the men instead of to the pasha, and he's playing chess with the pasha and doing other things that the men aren't doing. And in Cowdery's journal, he also writes about visiting one of the pasha's gardens, and he's very critical of the landscaping. So you think on the one hand, the men are being forced to work, and then the doctor's big complaint is the landscaping in the pasha's garden. So maybe you're right, Megan, that the officers don't have it as badly. They are, and being in a palace, in the worst room of the palace, is probably better than being in the best room of the prison. So, yeah. So let's take a look then, because Bainbridge also writes to Preble. Of course, Preble doesn't find out until almost the end of November about this episode. So let me just see if I can find this letter of, Preble to Bainbridge. And then if you read through Bainbridge's letters to Preble, because it's hard for Preble to get a letter back to him, you get this real tone of complaint about why you haven't written back to me. And let's see, this is Preble's letter to, he had received the letter of the 15th, which was the 15th of November. Okay, so one issue that has come up here is that Preble had captured a Tripolitan ship, the Mashuda, and the men from the Mashuda send a report that they were treated very badly by Preble and by the Americans. And this justifies Tripoli then in treating these Americans badly. And so Preble is writing back saying, you may inform, the prime minister of Tripoli is Mohammed Jiz, who is he's actually I believe he's Albanian or Circassian, who has come to Tripoli actually as a slave, and he becomes then the prime minister. And so Preble is informing him of various things. And let me just see if I can find, this isn't the letter I was thinking of. But here's Preble's letter to the Secretary of the Navy after finding out about the loss of the, let's see. Who can read this one to us? Megan, do you want to read this one?
Sir, I had the honor to write you from Algiers Bay, Colonel Leer and family, since which no opportunity has occurred until now. I left that bay on the 22nd November to proceed off Tripoli with the Nautilus and company, and on the 24th off the southwest end of Sardinia, spoke of an English frigate from Malta, the captain of which informed me of the loss of the Philadelphia on the rocks off Tripoli, but was not able to give me the particulars of the distressing intelligence, which induced me to steer for Malta to gain further information. On the 26th,
you can take a pause and we'll just talk a little. So this is essentially just a report about where he has been. So he wrote to the secretary from Algiers, and then he left on the November 22nd, and then he speaks an English frigate. That means these two ships passed each other, saw each other, and using their trumpets probably exchanged news, and the English frigate told him about the loss of the Philadelphia, but that was all Preble learns. So Preble learns about this on the 24th of November. So more than 3 weeks after it had happened. Okay, sorry, go.
On the 26th, between the island of Maritimo and Cape Bon, chased and boarded Tunisian Quebec of 18 guns on a cruise with the passport of George Davis. American charged affairs at Tunis and permitted her to proceed. 27th arrived off the harbor of Malta and sent in a boat with an officer on shore, who returned with letters from Captain Bainbridge dated at Tripoli, stating the particulars of the capture of the Philadelphia by the Tripolitans, without a man on either side having been killed or wounded, with the mortifying circumstance that she was in the harbor of Tripoli. This affair distresses me beyond description and very much deranges my plans of operation for the present. I fear our national character will sustain an injury with the barbarians. That the officers and crew of the Philadelphia had one and all determined to prefer death to slavery. It is possible such a determination might save them from either. Enclosed is Captain Bainbridge's account of the business, with sundry other papers as list. I shall not hazard an opinion on the subject of the loss.
Okay, good. That's good. Very good. Okay, so he tells then about, so in his letter to Bainbridge, I think I also shared it with you, he's much more conciliatory than in this one, where he says he wished they would all have preferred slavery to death, and such a determination might have saved them from either one. And so what do you make of this? What is Preble's reaction to the loss of the Philadelphia? Gee, that's too bad. Win some, lose some. We'll figure a way out of this.
Are you talking about when Preble writes to Bainbridge? Or when, or the one where Preble's writing to the
This one
Secretary
to the
of the Navy?
Secretary of the Navy. Yeah. Well, you've read both, so there's a difference in tone, I think, in these two letters. To the Bainbridge, he is more conciliatory, saying, "I'm sure you did everything you can," but then to the Secretary of the Navy, he's saying, "I wish they actually would have fought, or preferred death to slavery." It's easy enough thing to tell someone else they should prefer that, but still, the fact that Bainbridge really hadn't fought seems to get Preble. And he also sees that his plan was to use these two frigates to really blockade Tripoli, but now he can't. Plus, you have Tripoli realizing they'd beaten the United States. So that's really a bad place for Preble to start off with his campaign to subdue Tripoli. Yeah, so this really puts Preble in a bind, and we'll see if there is a way out of this. Let's see, let's go a little further here. Okay, here's another letter from Bainbridge to Preble. Okay, Sean, do you want to read this one? I will always think of Bainbridge, you and Bainbridge together now.
I would be honored. So if you could just make it a little more bigger again, I'll get right into it. Sir, by this conveyance, you will receive 2 letters from me, given particular information of our situation, and also informed you of our want of money. I have this day received from the Minister of Foreign Affairs $500, for which I have given him bills on Leghorn at 15% loss to the drawer. If we do not get money occasionally sent us from Malta, or a credit on which I can draw at Tunis, we shall be much necessitated for means of subsistence. In my former letters, I mentioned that our crew was kept employed, the mechanics at their respective trades, the other at various work. We had on board a smart gang of carpenters who are employed in working on a new schooner. M. Goodby, ? Our head carpenter, has not been ordered to work before this day, has received orders from the Bashaw to build a gunboat. If there's not a positive order given to the crew, and particularly to the mechanics, Tripoli will receive great advantage from their labor, and they cannot receive much worse treatment than they do. for they are only allowed bread scarcely sufficient for them to subsist on, and the interest the Babshah has in their lives will prevent him from starving them entirely. I do not conceive it policy in me to give the order, and was I to do it, I would not have the same weight as if it come from you. Should they persist for the fear of more severe treatment, I think they should be considered as having alienated themselves from the United States. If they preferred turning Mahometans, the choice was free. There has already turned the following persons: John Wilson, a Swede, quartermaster; Louis Hacksener, a German, ordinary seaman; Thomas Prince, boy; Peter West, an American, carpenter's crew.
Great, thank you. So we see a lot going in here that actually Bainbridge has two letters he is sending to Preble on this day. The first, and he says that he needs money, that he was able to get money from Gigi's, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but in exchange for giving him letters of credit on Livorno or Leghorn, and that this is a way of supporting the officers and the crew. And then how many of the members of the crew are being put to work? The mechanics, the carpenters now are building a ship, and then he worries about should they be doing this. But then also it ends with these 4 members of the crew who have converted to Islam, and then alienating themselves from the United States, and they prefer turning Mohammedan, which would have been the phrase word the Americans would have used for Muslims. So, and 2 of them are foreigners: the Swedish quartermaster and a German sailor, and then 2 others are American. So this is seems to be a threat here. What's going to happen to these guys in captivity? This is, well before the Geneva Convention or anything. And, so should Bainbridge allow them to go to work? And also there's another letter, because Bainbridge has this idea, since a number of the sailors are British, maybe we could claim that they're British subjects, and then have Lord Nelson, who is also in the Mediterranean, redeem them. And when that idea is floated to Lord Nelson, he says, well, if they are British, that means they're deserters, and I would have no choice but to hang them. So that's not going to work. It's, what could Bainbridge do? I'm feeling more empathetic for Bainbridge than I was when we read the first letter. Not just he's, now telling Preble about this problem he has, needing money, and can Preble send him more money? And I don't know, any other thoughts on this? Poor Bainbridge.
I was gonna say he definitely seems like I wasn't like compelled to kind of laugh at his situation this time.
Yeah,
he seems like he's kind of in between a rock and a hard place, like how he said in the first one, where he just kind of ran ashore on a harbor that no one knew about.
Yeah,
like seems like he's just have some tough decisions to make.
Yeah. And it's been 6 weeks now that he's been imprisoned in Tripoli. It's not ending soon. So yeah, so it is getting tougher. Okay, let's see what else we have here in the mailbag. Okay. Okay, so Tobias Leer is the American consul in Algiers. So he's actually the American diplomat responsible for American affairs generally in the Mediterranean. And here it's December 16th, and he had just learned the day before about the captivity of Bainbridge and the crew in Tripoli. And then he tells him that Davis, who is the American chargé d'affaires at Tunis, had sent him things and is going to help alleviate his situation. And he says he wants to learn the particulars of this business, saying, we've only learned that on the 30th of October in the afternoon, the Philadelphia, chasing a Tripolitan corsair, ran aground about 2 miles from Tripoli. So this is what we have learned. And he wants to know more, but also says if it can be of any alleviation to your misfortune, to know that everyone here takes a deep and feeling interest in your situation. You will enjoy the satisfaction in the highest degree, for no citizen of the United States has had a better opportunity than yourself of making favorable impressions here. So everyone in Algiers feels really badly for poor Bainbridge. Remember, in Bainbridge in 1800 had been in Algiers, and then he was the commander of the USS George Washington, and the George Washington was forced to carry the Dey of Algiers tribute to Istanbul. So, Bainbridge had spent time in Algiers and they remembered him fondly. It wasn't really it was not a happy time for Bainbridge then, being forced to shuttle the Dey's tribute. And then he tells him what Preble has been up to, and the Dey of Algiers seems to be in a good humor. And so this is a very sympathetic letter from an American diplomat. And let's take a look at this one from Preble to the warrant and petty officers. And who can read this one?
I can read it.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Although the fortune of war has made you prisoners to the Bashaw of Tripoli, it has not made you his slaves. Whether you will be slaves or not depends on yourselves. Your determination not to work will be proper, and if the Bashaw should attempt compulsion by punishing you for refusal, I shall retaliate on his subjects, which I now have, and which may hereafter come into my possession. If you conduct properly, you will in due time be redeemed and restored to your friends and entitled to receive full pay from the time of your capture to your arrival in the United States. In the meantime, every proper means will be taken for clothing and keeping you as comfortable as circumstances will admit of. But should any of you voluntarily engage your services to the enemy and afterwards fall into the hands of your justly incensed countrymen, you will undoubtedly suffer death, agreeable to the laws of the United States in such cases made and provided. You ought not to let the threats of those into whose hands you have unfortunately fallen intimidate you, but obstinately persist in your rights of being treated as prisoners and not as slaves. I shall write to the Bashaw immediately and acquaint him with all the Americans who suffer themselves to be compelled to work for him will be considered as having alienated themselves from the United States, and of course our government will not consider itself under any obligations to ransom them. Behave like Americans, be firm, and do not despair. The time of your liberation is not far distant. I am with sentiments of regard and consideration, your friend, Edward Preble.
Wow, thank you. So what do we make of this?
I thought that was really intense because I remember reading through it and being like, wow, like he literally says, and we do come to terms when we'll like try to get you guys back into America. If you help them, we literally like, we won't get you back. Like we'll just like leave you there.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I don't know. I just found it to be like a lot. And I don't know how like honor worked. They're all obviously very concerned with their honor. Like Bainbridge was like his biggest concern was how his countrymen viewed him. And so I could see that honor was obviously a very important thing to them.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, without that, what do you have? I'm thinking about what Sarah found out about the exchange between Jackson and Randolph. His honor is really this essential thing, and Bainbridge feeling he'd lost his, near Preble is telling them this. I don't think, from my reading, Preble sent this to Bainbridge along with letters to others. I don't know if Bainbridge sent this to the petty. Yes, Trevor.
I was just going to ask what year this was written. Like, when is this happening?
This is January of 1804. Okay,
So around the same time, aren't the British like forcefully conscribing like American merchants too? Isn't it kind of the same deal? Why wouldn't
impressing them. Yes, it is. Yes, yeah.
Why wouldn't they be considered traitors in the same way?
That's a very good point. In fact, it comes up when the United States, is preparing for war with England, that the United States was, that actually France had been capturing American merchant ships. Britain is taking American merchant ships. There's not as much of a reaction. I think one difference here is these men aren't on a merchant ship. They are in the United States Navy. So that puts them in a different relationship to the United States than men who are on merchant ships. But you're right, there is that similar issue. In 1807, there is the encounter between the Chesapeake and the Leopard over Americans who had been impressed by the British, and that becomes a huge issue. And that's just a handful of men. Here you have 300. So you're right, it's a very good point, a very good thing to keep in mind, that this isn't something happening in isolation. And good. I don't know that Bainbridge actually sent this to the midshipmen and to the officers and to the men about this. It is, as Megan said, really an intense thing. You could think that this is, and behave like Americans, which isn't something you heard from Bainbridge. And though you are prisoners, you're not slaves. Yes, Megan.
You said, so it was sent to Bainbridge and it was on Bainbridge to show it to his men.
Yeah.
So Bainbridge is the one that really sold them out to Preble. In his letter to Preble, he said, "Oh, and by the way, like all the men are, helping them because they're, they said, all right, help us or we'll punish you or not give you enough bread and stuff like that."
Yeah.
So do you think that might have been the reason, because he's the one who sold them out? Do you think that's why he didn't show it to them?
That could very well be. And, both Bainbridge and Preble were hard officers, were tough guys. But with Bainbridge, you have the men always complaining about him. And with Preble, there is a real respect for Preble. And I think it says something about these two guys as leaders, that Bainbridge, by his constant flogging, is trying to make up for something, trying to make them respect him. And with Preble, it's something else. And Preble's health isn't very good. He didn't think he doesn't live much long after this war. He had taken the first American warship that goes into the Indian Ocean, the Essex. Preble had commanded during the war with France, and that had really broken down his health. And now he's suffering, but he has this real cantankerousness, I think. So yeah, that's, and then he says, he closes this letter saying that your time of your redemption is near, which he does have something in mind. That is, he's captured an American, actually a Tripolitan vessel, and the one that they were complaining about earlier. And what can we do with that vessel? And what Preble, it's unclear whose idea this is, but what is going to happen is this vessel, the Merbuka, is going to be renamed the Intrepid. And a crew it's going to be disguised as a Tripolitan, as a merchant vessel. And it's going to go into Tripoli harbor disguised as a merchant vessel, and they are going to blow up the Philadelphia. Right now, the Pasha of Tripoli is arranging either to use the Philadelphia as a warship. More likely, he's going to sell it to Tunis because he needs the money, and Tunis will buy it. And so what the Americans are planning to do is actually go into Tripoli harbor and destroy the Philadelphia before they can do that. And so that is what happens. Let me see if I can show you this. Okay. Here it is. Then Lieutenant Decatur, and Decatur had come to Boston at the same time that Preble had come to fit out the Constitution. Preble is given command of a vessel called the Argus, which he then sails to the Mediterranean and turns it over to Isaac Hull. And now he volunteers for this mission, and he and 70 men come into Tripoli on this is the Intrepid, and they come in, they have all kinds of stuff that they are dragging to slow them down, because their story is they were damaged in a recent storm. This is in February of 1804. And it has both oars and sails. And so they come into Tripoli harbor, and they come next to the Philadelphia that does have a crew of maybe 30 or 40 Tripolitans aboard it. And they board it, they overpower the Tripolitans. They kill 20, the others they force overboard. And then some men go below and start setting fires. And then they take one of the cannon and load it with shot and fire it down below. And so the ship catches fire. And meanwhile, the batteries of Tripoli realize, well, this isn't just a merchant ship coming, it's something else. In fact, when they boarded, the Tripolitans started shouting Americanos, that they knew they were Americans and not just a merchant vessel. And they have overpowered the crew. The Philadelphia catches fire, and actually they could see this fire for miles into the desert. And the Americans all get off and begin rowing away. One of the things that happens, as this fire starts, it draws all of the air from around toward it, which means this vessel can't sail away from it because it's being pulled back. So the men actually have to row, and they row out of Tripoli harbor, and the Philadelphia is destroyed. And as the ship is burning, the cannon had been loaded, and the cannons start firing. And then, of course, the gunpowder explodes. So it's a tremendous explosion with the destruction of the Philadelphia. And in fact, some of the blast of the Philadelphia, it might have been a subsequent one, an American shot during the siege of Tripoli in August, that one of the shots hits the palace and actually hits the wall above where Bainbridge is sleeping. And so the plaster and the dust fall on Bainbridge. But this is a tremendous feat. And when Decatur returned, we actually have his letter to Preble telling him about this. Let me see if I can show this to you. Who wants to read Decatur's letter from the Ketch Intrepid, February 17th, 1804?
I'll read
I
it.
have a request.
Trevor wants to be Decatur, since we think about you as Bainbridge.
Could you zoom in like you did before?
Yes.
Sir, I have the honor to inform you that in pursuance of your orders of the first instance to proceed with this catch of the harbor of Tripoli, there to endeavor to effect the destruction of the United States frigate Philadelphia. I arrived there in company with the U.S. Brig Searon,
Lieutenant Commander Stewart.
Okay, Lieutenant Commander Stewart on the 7th, but owing to the badness of the weather, was unable to effect anything until last evening, when we had a light breeze from the northeast. At 7 o'clock, I entered the harbor with the Intrepid, the Searon having claimed her station without the harbor, in a situation to support us in our retreat at 9:30 carried here.
Laid her.
Carried later?
No, laid her. You skipped a line.
Laid her along the Philadelphia, boarded, and after short contest carried her. I immediately fired in the storerooms, gunroom, cockpit, and berth deck, and remained on board until the flames had ensued from the spar deck hatchways and ports. And before I got from alongside the fire, had communicated to the rigging and tops. Previous to our boarding, they had got to the Tompkins out and hailed several times, but not a gun fired. The noise occasioned by boarding and contending for possession, although no firearms were used, gave a general alarm on shore, and on board their cruisers which lay about a cable and a half length from us, and many boats filled with men lay round, but from whom we received no annoyance. They commenced a fire on us for all their batteries on shore, but with no other effect than one shot passing through our top gallant sail. The frigate was moored within half gunshot of the Bashaw's castle and of their principal battery. Two of their cruisers lay within 2 cables lengths on the starboard quarter, and their gunboats within half gunshot on the starboard bow. She had all her guns mounted and loaded, which, as they became hot, went off as she lay with her broadside to the town. I have no doubt, but some damage has been done by them. Before I got out of the harbor, her cables had burned off, and she drifted in under the castle where she was consumed. I can form no judgment as to the number of men that were on board of her. There were about 20 killed. A large boat got off, and many leapt into the sea. We have made 1 prisoner, and I fear from the number of bad wounds he has received will not recover, although every assistance and comfort has been given him. I boarded with 60 men and officers, leaving a guard on board the ketch for her defense, and it was with the greatest pleasure, I inform you, I had not a man killed in this affair, and but 1 slightly wounded. Every support that could be given I received from my officers, and as each of their conduct was highly meritorious, I beg leave to enclose you a list of their names. Permit me also, sir, to speak of the brave fellows I have the honor to command, whose coolness and intrepidity was such as I trust will ever characterize the American
sailors, yes.
Okay. It would be injustice in me were I to pass over the important services rendered by M. Salvatore, the pilot, on whose good conduct the success of the enterprise in this greatest degree depended, gave me an entire satisfaction. I have the honor to be, sir, with great respect, your
most obedient servant,
signed Stephen Decatur.
Wow. So that's quite a story.
So just to clarify a couple elements of that story that might be confusing. One is that one of the great things about these transcripts, they're typed up and everything, and so they're relatively clear to read. But as you can tell, punctuation was not really a priority for people writing at the time. Yes. And so it is really frequently, when you're reading these original documents and doing this kind of historical research, it can be really difficult sometimes to tell where sentences are intended to break or not, and what they're trying to say. So it's sort of fascinating in that regard. A couple other terms he uses that might be confusing in a couple of the notes. Wherever you see, wherever you see that tiny superscript letter, this was a method of abbreviation in handwriting at the time. And so things like Mr. and Lieutenant and even, obedient, you'll get the first letter and then a tiny superscript subletter. And when they wrote it in hand, they wrote it exactly the same way, with superscript, tiny letter. And that's the method of abbreviation. Another thing that can be kind of tough to kind of learn how to read. A cable's length, he mentions the term a cable in a couple different ways. cables were a reference to the actual line that's connecting to the anchor that we heard one of the crew members talk about last week. But a cable length was also a measurement of distance that was considered equal to 1/10 of a nautical mile, or about 100 fathoms, a fathom being 6 feet. So whenever he says a cable's length, he's talking about 600 feet of distance. And so that kind of gives you a sense of the scale that was going on as this sort of unfolded. And then when he said, obviously, he fired different elements of the ship, meaning he literally just set fire to them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So what do we make of that? And I should say, Decatur also thought he was not a very good writer. So he didn't write a lot, but what also means what he did write is relatively concise. And Salvatore Catalano was the pilot. He was actually from Naples. And so he's someone they met who knew the harbor of Tripoli. And as I said, they had gone in disguised as a merchant ship. Most of the sailors were below deck, and Decatur and a few of the officers were aboard, but they had like coats on over their uniforms. And Catalano, the pilot who knew the lingua franca of the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean, it was a combination of Spanish and Italian, and in the Western, it was where Tripoli was, it would have been more Turkish and Italian and French. And so he knew that. And so this is a big deception. So Salvatore Catalano, who winds up actually getting a pension from the Navy for this. But so about a dozen men are on the deck, because that's how many you would have on a merchant ship. And then when they get next to the Philadelphia, the rest of the men have come up to the top deck, and then they board the ship using, So what do you make of this? What would you make of this story if you're Captain Preble and you get this report?
I won't lie, I'm loving it. I think it was like a scene out of a movie.
This is great. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, it is great. It is like a movie. And Preble immediately writes to the president saying that he wants Decatur to be promoted to captain. He's a lieutenant now, and he becomes the youngest man still ever to become a captain in the Navy, as Preble hopes that other lieutenants see someone doing this, it will encourage them so that they will want to become captains too. By going into Tripoli harbor and destroying this ship. And this is really sending a message. And this is actually, when Lord Nelson hears about this, he says, "This is the boldest act of naval heroism of the age." And so, that's this moment as Decatur destroys the Philadelphia in the harbor of Tripoli. So, Bainbridge, yes, Carl.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but Bainbridge actually witnesses a portion of this from his cell as well too, right?
Yeah, he does. And he had written to Preble a few days before saying it would be possible to do this. But by that time, Decatur and Stewart are already off the coast of Tripoli preparing for this. So it already was in the works. And so, so Bainbridge does see it, but then he thinks maybe this was a mistake, because then, of course, this really irritates the captors. And it's after this that Bainbridge and the other officers are sent into the prison with the rest of the men. They're released after, they're sent back to the palace after this, but it's really something that does unnaturally, it upsets the Tripolitans. And and it destroys the ship. And there's a story later on in 1815, Decatur is sent back to the Mediterranean, and he goes to Tunis and he goes to negotiate new treaties. It's a long story. It also involves Bainbridge, because Bainbridge had been building a fleet to go to the Mediterranean in 1815. And Washington Irving, the novelist, who is a friend of Decatur, says, if someone got there before Bainbridge, they could probably accomplish everything. And so Decatur gets his vessel built, fitted out faster. He gets to the Mediterranean. He does negotiate all of these treaties. While he's in Tunis, he sends a message ashore with the diplomat who's with him that he would like to negotiate a treaty. And the Bey of Tunis says, is this the same man who blew up Pasha Yusuf's ship in the harbor? Yes, it's him. Well, I'll sign the treaty. It's, it is, as Carl said, like a movie. And, so Trevor, you'll get to be Decatur in the movie.
The other thing that always struck me about this too, though, is like the juxtaposition, right? Like as we're thinking about, the development of the early U.S. Navy officer corps and what they're expected to achieve. And like, now as we sit here today, we've got like 200 plus years of all of these like great dramatic stories, World War I, World War II, 1812, Civil War, blah, blah, blah. But at the time, you're talking about only like, less than a dozen years since the real founding of the Navy. And this officer corps is really just beginning. And there isn't that same legacy that we intuitively, take for granted today of all of these great officers doing dramatic deeds. But here you've got one guy who is relatively senior in this, fledgling officer corps, who seems to be just throwing up his hands in surrender at the first time anything happens, every time it happens. And then here's this other young guy who is willing to, risk seemingly certain death to go out and clean up the mess left behind by the first guy.
Yeah.
And Bainbridge is as a result. I never have thought that juxtaposition was lost either on the Secretary of the Navy or the rest of the American public, who were wondering, what the hell are we doing with this guy?
Yeah. Really, it's very true. And as Carl was saying, there isn't a tradition, but they're really creating one. And
right.
Any institution today does have Bainbridges. They're lucky if they have Decaturs and Prebles. And the core of officers who are going really in the War of 1812 to establish the reputation of the United States are going to be known as Preble's boys, because many of them are officers who served under Preble. Hull was commanding one of the other vessels in the fleet. Decatur, obviously, Stewart, who's commanding the other vessel. McDonough is a midshipman, and when Decatur boards the Philadelphia, McDonough is immediately behind him, and McDonough will be the hero of the Battle of Lake Champlain, which may be the most important naval battle in American history. And so you have this corps of officers who are under Preble, and it's really creating a different tradition for the Navy, a Navy that's going to fight rather than, as Carl said, throw up their hands and say, well, we guess we can't do anything more here. And it is, as in that letter of Preble's where he said, behave like Americans. I could see, in addition to having Trevor read that, I could hear Clint Eastwood or John Wayne reading that and have the same kind of impact, or Denzel Washington. So it's like, yeah. So that's
suck up and deal.
That's right. Yeah. So let's see if what else we have here in our file of documents. Well, there's a letter from Robert Spence to his mother about what he is up to. So this wonderful heroic act doesn't actually end the war. And then in the fall of, actually late summer of 1804, Preble does bring the fleet into Tripoli harbor to bombard Tripoli. And here you have another of these episodes where Decatur, who's in command of part of the American, the Constitution is the flagship of this. So Constitution is in Tripoli harbor as part of the bombardment of Tripoli in the fall of 1804, late summer, early fall of 1804. And at this time, as Preble is doing this, he also knows that the United States has decided to send a bigger fleet. After, the word got back to the United States about the loss of the Philadelphia, and so President Jefferson realizes he needs to send more force. It does send more ships, and on these ships come a couple of officers who are senior to Preble, which means they are going to be in command of this fleet once they've arrived. So Preble wants to try to win the war before they arrive so that he's not going home having only partially accomplished what he did. And it's during this second attack in Tripoli in August of 1804 that Decatur has captured a couple of Tripolitan vessels, and then his brother, who was in command of one of the gunboats, a Tripolitan gunboat, had surrendered to Stephen Decatur's younger brother. And then when young James Decatur came to board, the Tripolitan captain shot him. Now, according to the legend, when Stephen Decatur heard about his brother's death, he turned his boat around. He was heading out of Tripoli at the end of the day, turns his boat around, goes and finds the gunboat that had surrendered to his brother, and he and his men board it. And he goes and finds the officer who had killed his brother, and they engage in hand-to-hand combat on the deck of the ship. And the captain has Decatur pinned to the deck. And at one moment, you can see in this later painting, a Tripolitan sailor has his sword raised and is about to whack Captain Decatur with his sword. An American sailor intervenes and saves his captain. And at the same time, Decatur finds his pistol in his pocket and shoots the Tripolitan captain who had killed his brother. If you thought that the destruction of the Philadelphia was enough for a movie, what do you make of this story? This is exactly, if there weren't a story like this, someone would have to make one up. And news also arrives at about this time that Stephen Decatur's been promoted to captain, and that's, but Tripoli does not surrender after this. And this is another scene of Decatur fighting with the Tripolitan. By the way, this sailor, his name was Daniel Fraser, but somehow the story emerged that actually the sailor's name was Reuben James. And Reuben James is another of these names that looms large in American lore. The Reuben James was, there are ships named for Reuben James, and one was a American merchant ship sunk by the Germans at the beginning of the Second World War. So, these stories become part of naval lore from the bombardment of Tripoli. Now, at the same time, Trevor asked, this is another one, Lieutenant Summers wanted to do something similar to what Decatur had done. So he takes a crew on a catch, actually on the Intrepid, into Tripoli harbor loaded with explosives. And Summers is the officer in command. Israel Wadsworth is one of the officers, and also a midshipman or lieutenant named Henry Wadsworth. Henry Wadsworth, who is from Maine, and their ship, that somehow they are discovered, and so rather than be captured, they blow up their ship. They blow up the Intrepid in Tripoli harbor, and this is a scene of it blowing up. And Summers, they're obviously all killed, including Summers and Henry Wadsworth. A year or two later, Henry Wadsworth's sister back in Maine marries a guy named Longfellow, and she names her firstborn son after her brother who had died in Tripoli, and the son becomes a poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, meanwhile, William Eaton was the American consul in Tunis, and while he was in Tunis, he met with the Pasha of Tripoli's older brother, Hamid Karamanli. And Eaton gets this interesting idea that if the United States supported Hamid Karamanli and brought him into Tripoli, the people of Tripoli would rise up in support of him against his brother. And his brother, he said, not only had usurped the throne, but also must be a pretty bad guy. So naturally, the people of Tripoli will rise up. And Eaton goes back to Washington and presents this idea to Secretary of State Madison. And Secretary of State Madison says, well, yes and no. If you think this will work, do it. But officially, we're not really trying to change whoever the Pasha of Tripoli is. So Eaton is sent back to the Mediterranean. The Navy actually takes him. He has to go find Hamid Karamanli in Egypt, which he does. And then he and about a dozen Marines and an army of several hundred Arabs and Greek mercenaries march from Egypt into Libya. And in April of 1805, they take the city of Dern on the coast of Libya. And they capture Dern in April of 1805. The Marines, Presley O'Bannon is the captain of the Marines in this expedition. And this, as Trevor asked, is why the Marine hymn has the shores of Tripoli as part of it. And the idea is we'll capture Dern and then from there march on and take Tripoli, which is about 600 miles away. And they do capture Dern. The people, though, don't rise up in support of Hamid Karamanli. And a ship or an American ship arrives off the coast, and Eaton believes these must be the reinforcements, but no, it's word coming that while Eaton has been doing this back in Tripoli on board the USS Constitution, the Tobias Leer and the American consul general in Algiers had been negotiating with the Tripolitan government to end the war. And so the peace treaty with Tripoli is signed aboard the Constitution. And as they are doing this in April and May of 1805, the carpenter of the Constitution is making a new flagpole for the American consulate. And this ship is arriving in Dern to tell Eaton, we're here to get the Americans out because the war is over. And Eaton feels betrayed. However, the war does end in 1805. This is a better picture of the Constitution during the bombardment of Tripoli with the American ships and gunboats. Preble actually commissioned this painting to be done when he returned home to Maine. He wanted to have a document showing what the attack on Tripoli had looked like. So the United States makes peace with Tripoli in 1805. You know, by the way, if you've ever been behind the State House heading toward Temple Street, has anyone ventured down to what used to be part of Suffolk's campus before we sold the Archer building, the Donahue building? You go down the steps. What's the name of that street? On Beacon Hill.
Which street again?
On Beacon Hill behind the State House.
The one where the law school, the old law school?
No, that's Temple Street. So it intersects Temple Street. You go down the steps from the State House and you're on a little street that was named at this time when they were naming the streets on Beacon Hill for prominent Federalists like Pinckney, or like for Mount Vernon, or for Hancock. And there's a little pizza place on the corner, which also is named for the street.
Yeah, is that not the one where the old law school is on? Like when you walk down, it's on the left, the cute little pizza store on the right.
That's Temple Street. That's Temple Street. You're at the top of the hill. We're getting bogged down here. See,
everybody's looking up Google Maps. I can see it.
Yeah.
I used to know it too because I would go there all the time.
You go there all the time. Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, it's too bad. The pandemic is killing our memory of our knowledge of the streetscapes around us.
I even forget the name of the pizza place, and I went there a couple times.
Florino, I think.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's it. That is it.
Durning Street.
Dern Street. And it used to be the Dern Street Deli. And why is it called Dern Street? Do you know why, Sarah? It's called Dern Street. Where was this big battle? The first time the American flag flies over a foreign city conquered by American Marines. Dern in Libya, okay? So 1805. But then this victory that leads to, well, the war's already over, guys. We're here to get you out. And Eaton feels very upset with this, but that's not our story. The Navy and the Marines have kind of different stories about who won the Tripolitan War. And since we're working with the USS Constitution Museum, we'll take the Navy side of it, that it's the bombardment and the work of Preble and his guys. If you're a Marine, you'll say it was Presley O'Bannon and the Marines who took Dern. And in fact, the Marines to this day carry a curved sword, which is called the Pasha's sword, and have other bits of their history they trace back to the Marines at the Battle of Dern. And since, I don't know, when you're all back in downtown Boston, or if you are, Megan, I can't tell where you are from your background, looks very academic.
Yeah, I'm in the dorms. That's why I had no excuse. I walk by on that street like every single day.
Okay, yeah. And in fact, there's a plaque on the wall about William Eaton and the Battle of Dern. So, so anyway, this is, actually I can show you more from this history.
Hey, Bob, while you're pulling these pictures up, can I ask you to maybe, I know we're running out of time here, but I'm curious, I'd be curious to hear you speak for a moment about sort of the depiction of Tripolitans and in these battle scenes, and sort of the overall sense that among Americans, that in this particular instance, you know, they really were fighting the barbarians, and this sort of, you know, Orientalism and a sense of kind of, you know, exotic savages that they were fighting. You know, Trevor asked earlier about why these would have been treated differently as cooperating with the enemy than with the British, and sort of the overarching kind of nature of you know, the sense of this.
That's a good question. Also, a very big question. You know,
Yeah,
but you can
we
see.
got 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But you can see also this idea about turning Turk or converting to Islam. That's different from, you know, joining the British Navy or the French Navy. It's really a big change. On the other hand, once so you do have this idea of this difference. In fact, there's a play, we don't actually have a copy of it, that was performed sometime in this period, like 1800, 1801, apparently very popular as kind of lowbrow entertainment. And I only know about it because Washington Irving went and he wrote this really scathing review, not only of the play, but of the audience's reaction to it. And it's about an American warship that gets into a fight with a Tripolitan ship, but off the coast of England. Somehow a storm had blown both of these ships from the Mediterranean off the coast of England. It's one of the plot improbabilities that Irving made a lot of. And it's there so that the American audience is watching this, but also on the stage, you have a British audience on the cliffs of Dover watching this American conflict with a Tripolitan ship. It's though we're teaching not only Tripoli a lesson, we're teaching England and France, who have been paying these people off, a lesson. This is why Jefferson, I think, was so much interested in not paying tribute, but building a navy. So we can show Britain and France, who are using Algiers in the 1780s and 1790s, then Tripoli in the first decade, how you deal with countries like this that are not, you know, not acting the way they should. You also see, by the way, among Americans, it's not just that they're in North Africa and they're different. There's also, I believe, an idea that we could be very much the same thing. That is, the United States is stretched along this coast. And what kind of a country will we become? You see a lot of literature here on this. In fact, I have another whole career in telling that particular story of these images of the Islamic world here. This was a book by a French philosophe, The Ruins, or a Survey of the Revolutions of Empire by the Abbé Volney. And Volney in the 1780s had traveled through Syria and Mesopotamia, and he wrote a book about traveling in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Travel books are very popular. Then he wrote this book, The Ruins, or a Survey of the Revolutions of Empires. And what he's saying is, here you have these places, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mauritania in West Africa, that all had been these tremendous civilizations. And now they're deserts. What happened? And how did this happen? You know, he's not just interested from an antiquarian perspective. He's really interested in why do countries decline? And Volney believed they declined because of the junction of state and church. And particularly, he's not necessarily saying Islam is going to lead to this, but any kind of state religion is. It's religious intolerance, so not so much as, you know, we think Islam is a bad religion. So he writes this book on the ruins of empires, and you think, well, that's interesting. And here you see it's published in London in an English translation sometime in, I can't read the date at the very bottom, probably early 1790s. This is the Abbé Volney. In the first decade of the 19th century, Joel Barlow, who's an American poet and diplomat, undertakes a new translation, and his co-translator is Thomas Jefferson, who at the time is president of the United States. So Jefferson thought, this is such an important book, you need another translation of it, not because Jefferson's necessarily worried about Mesopotamia, but Jefferson's very much worried about America. And what will the American future be? And in Volney's book, he sees a real warning about what happens with a church and state working to suppress the human mind. So I see it as that, as opposed to simply this Orientalist idea. And my understanding of Edward Said's Orientalism is that that notion stems from a feeling of cultural superiority, which I am not sure that the Americans in this period would have felt, because this is a country that hasn't yet achieved the decadence or the power of the European states. But there's a real worry that we can achieve this, but then what happens? And you see this juxtaposition in a lot of places here. There's actually one of the newspapers notes in about 1803 or so. It juxtaposes Constantinople and Istanbul, where they've just recently allowed a printing press to be established because they didn't have a free press there. They didn't have a press at all. And this is the reason for the decay of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the next item is that Robert Fulton has returned from France to the United States. So you have this idea about the newness of the American polity, the possibilities, as well as the real danger that we could screw this up. And, you know, because there are other books that look at North Africa, which produces a lot of grain. In fact, it is the breadbasket of Europe. And in fact, the American consul in Tripoli, James Leander Cathcart, is one reason relations decline between Tripoli and the United States is Cathcart is engaging to try to monopolize the grain trade between Tripoli and Europe. And after the flagpole is cut down, Cathcart flees to Leghorn or Livorno, and his first letter to William Eaton, the consul in Tunis, is about, you know, if you can get a few cargoes of grain here, you'll make a real killing. It's not, boy, we really need to do something about Tripoli. There's still a real advantage here in the grain trade. So as I see it, you have both that sense of these folks are different from European states. Jefferson said, we'll never have a better cause or a weaker foe. but also you have this idea about the development of the American polity. How will it develop? Are we going to avoid the catastrophes that have befallen, not only the states of North Africa, but France or England? And after the peace treaty, you see particularly the Republican press, talking about how Tripoli really can learn from this. And Mohammed Jajiz, who is the foreign minister, is an enlightened statesman. And so by the way, when I started researching this, I thought I would find more of a racial cast to this. And I have to tell you, I didn't. Maybe I wasn't looking hard enough. It really is a sense of how Americans can define them. So that's why I think the important thing about Preble's letter, where he says, behave like Americans, which Bainbridge isn't saying. And that, I think, becomes the trajectory. So I could go on. In fact, I like nothing better than talking about the Tripolitan War. And now you think that's an alarming thought. And so I could go on, but I think, does anyone else have any questions?
Not so much a question, but I had like a general idea. And I know our final assignment is to write like a musical piece. And when we talked about this class, like the scene of like the dramatic stories out of like this like Tripolitan War, and especially like that showdown with the two captains. If you could like make this video like if you could like post it so like I can continue to look at that, I think that's where I want to do.
Yeah, this class is being recorded, and I would welcome, and Carl and I would like a percentage when you do write the musical of the Tripolitan War and the story of Decatur. I should tell you, a couple of years ago, I got a phone call from a guy who said, apparently was a producer at one time. He's quite advanced years, and he wanted someone to do a screenplay based on the life of Decatur. And then he kept going off saying, well, we need to get it to, Bradley Cooper. Get Bradley Cooper to see it. Roll for Bradley Cooper. And I thought, okay. So I did send a couple of pages to him, and then he said, well, you know what you need to do? You need to put in a role for Ed Asner. He's an old friend, a dear friend, and it would be wonderful for Ed Asner to have a role, maybe the wise old secretary of this, or the consul, or the secretary of the Pasha of Tunis or something, a role for Ed Asner. I thought, okay, I can. And they said, that would be such a fitting thing. And I can see Ed getting the long overdue Academy Award for it. And I'm kind of indulging this guy with
who did you recommend Ed play?
I said, well, it's one thing to write a role for Ed Asner. It's another thing if the expectation is this is going to win him an Academy Award. So, yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm sure. Well, now that can be your charge, a role for Ed Asner in this. And yeah.
Is he still? Yeah, he's still.
He's still alive. Yes. Yeah, so better do it quickly. So, anyway, I guess that's all the time you have. Anyway, so I will see you all next week. Be in touch. Post your videos on your artifacts, and so keep your questions coming in, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. And we're going to have another guest with us next week talking about the ship. And so, good.
And again, as you guys are working on your artifact videos, like Sarah said, she reached out and we were able to provide and find some other stuff. If you guys find yourself hitting dead ends on things, or there's questions that you got, don't hesitate to drop an email, and there may be stuff in our collections that can point you in the right direction.
Great. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
I'll definitely be in touch by email for some of those pages.
Yeah, no problem, Mike.
Talking about. Thank you.
Great. Well, take care, Carl.
Take it easy, bud. Have a good weekend.
See you. You too.